Hello, this is Dr. Adam J. Bach. In these two short audio presentations, we're going to talk about experiments. We'll begin by talking about the Lean Startup Framework, types of experiments, and a little bit about prototyping. In the second presentation, then we'll walk through a simple example. So it's important to understand the Lean Startup Framework is a relatively new perspective on entrepreneurial action. The underlying theory behind it is that it's unlikely or impossible to have perfect market information about new opportunities because of the inherent uncertainty associated with bringing new ideas to market. This is in contrast with sort of traditional thinking about strategy and management, where you can with enough research, you can predict where things will be in 6 months, a year, 2 years, 5 years, and then you can create a linear plan to get there. Instead, we assume that that's not possible, that some of the outcomes are based in part on the actions that we take. And the conclusion is that long-term planning is difficult or even potentially counterproductive because it prevents us from being prepared for alternate circumstances. Instead, we use what's called an action framework. That is, we're going to experiment iteratively towards figuring out what the viable outcome really is. That is, we'll do an experiment, find out the results, and then iterate based on that towards getting a product or service that actually fits customer needs. This basically operates within the framework of traditional scientific investigation, where we have hypotheses or assumptions about what we're expecting to see. We generate prototypes of our actual product or service and use those to conduct experiments, and from those experiments we answer our hypotheses, address our assumptions, learn, and adapt. So the underlying principle is fairly straightforward. Our goal is to generate and implement experiments that yield the maximum amount of actionable information for the least time, effort, and cost. A couple of important notes. Number one, we only want actionable information. That is, if we're collecting data that won't change what we're going to do or can't result in taking action and making choices, then we're collecting the wrong data in the first place. The second is that there's clearly a cost-benefit analysis that has to be done here. We need good information. We need to get it quickly and cheaply. If we can accomplish that, we use those results to understand what customers will actually buy. That allows us to either pivot what we're doing or to persevere with our plan, assuming that it seems to be working, until we reach a viable solution. It's useful to distinguish between an experiment and a prototype. So the prototype is an embodiment of whatever it is you're expecting to sell. So it's the thing or the service. The prototype is trying to create a version of that we can put in front of potential customers. The experiment, on the other hand, is the process of getting that in front of someone to see how they respond to it. It's pretty easy to get them confused, especially if you're dealing, for example, with a service rather than a product. But the important thing to remember is that the data comes from the experiment, right? The prototype in itself doesn't generate data. The prototype is what you put in front of customers. We're trying to get to information associated with customer behavior. That is, when they have the prototype in their hands, what do they actually do? So an experiment could be many things. It could be an interview with a customer. You could interview an expert or talk with a focus group. You could have what we call a paper test. That is, you have something that's not really the product itself, but is a depiction of the product. A storyboard explaining how a customer would use it. Maybe it's a white paper. That's how most blockchain ideas are propagated. It could be a wireframe example of an app that you plan to develop. It could even be advertising or other customer communication like a brochure. It could be a landing page, a website, or even a button to nowhere. I do want to point out that while your book is very enthusiastic about these ideas of landing pages and buttons to nowhere, I personally find that there are some ethical challenges associated with this, suggesting to a visitor to a website that you have something, and then when they give you their email address or they try to click on something, you inform them that actually it's not ready yet. I understand that there's no laws being broken here, but ethically, I want you to be aware that there are some gray areas. A/B testing is classic experimentation, something that companies like Google and Facebook are doing all the time, where you're presented with they have two populations of customers, and they present those two populations with very slight different variants to see which one generates the behavior that they want. It could be usability testing, where you actually have something close enough to see if the customer does use it and how they use it. Pre-selling can be an experiment. You can explain to people, like on Kickstarter, that you don't have the product yet, but you'll build it, but you want people to pay in advance. Any interaction with some variant of the product or service can be a type of experiment. Prototyping is a word that has a very specific connotation to it because so much of how American economic activity developed was around physical products. And so a prototype often seems to mean like a physical mock-up, sort of the miniature car or the little mini jet airplane that we put in the wind tunnel. But anything can be prototype. And it's just important to recognize that prototypes vary in fidelity. That is, how close are they to what the actual product is going to be? A prototype can be a looks-like prototype. That's kind of the way we traditionally think about them. You have a three-dimensional thing that looks like whatever it is that the customer is eventually going to buy. But it could be a functions-like prototype. That is, it's not really very similar, but it actually does the same work. It could be a minimum viable product, so that it's an actual product itself, just at the very basic limit of what a customer will pay for. For things like services, you could have a role-play prototype where you actually walk through the set of services and behaviors that would be involved. Again, it could be a storyboard or paper or any other mechanism that puts something into the hands or the experience of the customer so that you can get data back about how the customer would actually behave with it. So now that we've kind of described this, I'd encourage you to make sure you've gone back and review the chapter if you've not already done so. We're going to then, in the next presentation, walk through a relatively simple example with some ways that you can collect data if you've done your prototyping so you actually get the results of an experiment.